Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Hodges. I'm the president of McGuireWoods Consulting. We're really happy to have you here today for a discussion on the most recent 2020 elections from a state perspective. Let me just say a few words about our consulting firm and then talk about the presentation today. McGuireWoods Consulting is a subsidiary of the McGuireWoods Law Firm. Many of you may know this, but our law firm has over 1,200 lawyers in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and our consulting firm is a full-service public affairs firm with over 100 professionals. We have one of the largest state government affairs footprints in the United States. We also have offices in Washington, D.C., the southeastern states, Texas, Illinois, and our most recent addition, California. We do traditional lobbying and state and local government consulting within our footprint and around the country. And we have a practice you'll hear more about today, which is a national practice that focuses on the governors, the attorneys general, education officials, and insurance commissioners. We also have a communications and public relations service or practice and infrastructure and economic development incentives practice. So we're a full service public affairs firm that operates across the United States. Today, I'm particularly happy to bring this program to you involving state elections and state officials. We have a great group, Mona Mohib, Mike Reynolds, Scott Binkley, and myself, who will talk with you about the most recent elections. This group provides strategic guidance to clients that deal with the governors and the attorneys general, and they also assist clients in representation of them before groups like the National Association of Attorneys General, the National Governors Association, and the partisan groups, the Democratic Attorneys General, the Republican Attorneys General, the Democratic Governors Association, and the Republican Governors Association. We found over time that these groups collaborate a great deal on their work, and many of our clients want to be present at these meetings or have assistance in navigating the many issues involving these elected officials. With that, I'm going to turn the program over to our first presenter, Mona Mohib. Mona?
Thank you, Governor. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm thrilled to be on this call with everyone, including my colleagues, Mike Reynolds and Scott Binkley. And we're going to begin a little bit with some global overview on how the races went, and then spend some time talking about policy implications. So obviously last Tuesday were the elections, and as we have discussed before, the way the governor's races work, for example, are different than how we see it at the federal level, where on the federal level, the House is up for re-election every 2 years, and a third of the Senate is up. It is a different set of numbers, and this year we had 11 races up. So the Democrats, just speaking to the governor's side, all of our incumbents were reelected, which is the top priority for Democratic governors. So Governor Carney of Delaware, Governor Inslee of Washington, and one of the most competitive races, of course, was for the reelection of Governor Roy Cooper in North Carolina, who was elected to a second term with 52%, defeating the current Lieutenant Governor Dan Forest. I'd say the race for Governor Cooper was by far the top race for Democrats across the country. I think there was also a hope that we could hold on to the seat in Montana, currently held by Governor Bullock, who of course ran for the U.S. Senate. Lieutenant Governor Cooney was running for re-election and unfortunately wasn't able to make it over the top to hold on to that seat. So no pickups for the Democrats, but a very important hold on all their incumbents. So Mike or Scott?
Well, thanks, Mona. This is Scott Binkley. I think that that was a great overview, and I would contend that state-level Republicans exceeded expectations across the country last Tuesday. You mentioned a number of the races that were your held incumbent governors. Republicans reelected all 6 incumbent governors who were on the ballot, retained the open Republican seat in Utah, and increased their overall majority on the Republican governor's front by flipping previously democratically controlled Montana. And if you'll remember, that's a state that Republicans hadn't won in 20 years. So that said, the GOP governors were able to increase their majority to 27 Republicans, 23 Democrats by winning 8 of the 11 races last Tuesday. I think some would argue that Montana would have been the biggest gubernatorial prize this year. Again, Republicans had last won the office 20 years ago and were able to bring Greg Gianforte across the finish line, defeating Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney, as Mona mentioned earlier. One other thing that I wanted to highlight was that Republicans won with record margin in blue states like Vermont and New Hampshire, held Republican and suburban voters to win in states like Indiana and Missouri, as well as flipping the long-held seat in Democrat seat in Montana. And I think that the point here is that the diversity of these wins shows the strength of the Republican Party at the state level across the country going forward. And so those are some highlights that I wanted to raise. Mike, anything to add there?
Scott, could you just touch briefly about the implications? Why should folks care what happens in some of these states, especially if it's not in their footprint? What do these election results mean for the broader policy shifts and the way folks look at state government in general across the country?
Well, one thing that we'll come back to would be redistricting, and so we'll have a deeper dive on that. But a lot of effort had been put into these state races on the Democrat side and the Republican side because of the implications of redistricting. We'll come back to that. But I think that there are a number of issues. One thing we haven't gone into yet would be the state AG races. So with a Biden administration, I think that you'll see the Republican attorneys general revert to the position of being the referee, if you will, right? Making sure that the Biden administration doesn't overreach, making sure that their constituents have representation as the Biden administration looks to implement their policy priorities. Mona, that might be a good segue for you.
Sure.
To discuss that as well.
Sure. Similar to at the Democratic level, all of the Democratic incumbents running for re-election, but for North Carolina, all won re-election. So that would be Democrat Ellen Rosenblum in Oregon, Josh Shapiro, who we have probably seen quite a bit on TV in Pennsylvania, was running for re-election, TJ Donovan in Vermont, and Bob Ferguson in Washington. The North Carolina race, and I know we have a number of folks from North Carolina on the call, as of my last checking, was in the too close to call column, which I think is similar to the last time General Stein ran, also another close election. I think, as we know, North Carolina is an incredibly competitive state, as we saw both, as we continue to see at the presidential level, at the federal level, and with the governor. So again, the Democrats obviously were watching North Carolina, but for North Carolina, which we will see and sort of have every expectation that Attorney General will get reelected, all of their incumbents were reelected. I will say, we were talking about Montana earlier. I think there was a great hope amongst Democrats across the country. That was an open seat, and there was very much a hope that Democrat Rafe Graybill, who is counsel to current Governor Bullock, would be able to hold on to their seat. A lot of excitement around him, a lot of interest. Obviously a lot of focus on Montana generally, both at the federal and state level. I think that would have been the two open seats were Montana and Indiana. Both we had, as we discussed on our last call, incredible candidates in both. Challenge with Indiana is there wasn't a big race at the top of the ticket, so harder for Democratic money to get into the state. Completely opposite situation in Montana, where there was so much money coming in, primarily driven by the Senate race, which was one of the most competitive races in the country. So a little disappointing, but Rafe is a outstanding candidate, outstanding, person, and I think we will see him again. So kind of like with the governors, mostly hold and but no pickups on our end. So I think even though we don't have the North Carolina decision, the current breakdown would be 5 Republicans won, 4-1 with the North Carolina race being undecided. at this point. So the current breakdown would be 24 Democrats, which includes the Attorney General from the District of Columbia, 26 Republicans, and one to be determined in North Carolina. But I think that really ties into what Scott was alluding to, is what we've seen is the AGs in particular is a bit of a check on the presidency. So I think we all remember from the Obama administration, Republican attorneys general played a very significant role with an aggressive posture and sort of being a check on the federal government. That pivoted during the Trump administration, where for the last 4 years, and particularly with a new group of AGs that came in 2 years ago, a very aggressive posture by the Democratic AGs who saw themselves as, I think as they would say, sort of a check against egregious federal overreach. So the interesting thing will be is the Democratic AGs have been more in a defensive posture, and it will be interesting to see with a Democratic president how that will switch. But I think Scott, as you said, is exactly right. I think the roles of aggressive litigation may come from the Republicans over the next couple of years, but I'll defer to you and Mike.
Scott, would you like to talk briefly about what other, who else was on the ballot on Tuesday, and what happened with some of the state legislatures?
Yeah, that's a great point and a great segue to that conversation about redistricting and why it all matters, as we discussed. I think, Mike, I think that Republicans, I know Republicans have widely said that they exceeded expectations last Tuesday. I think if you will remember back, this was supposed to be the year that President Obama and former Attorney General Eric Holder's new group was to take hold for this very effort to put Democrats in a better position as the redistricting process began. There was about $500 million spent through that effort. Well, as you look across the country and the chambers that they targeted, unfortunately, they were not able to make gains. The Republicans held every legislative chamber that was in play and actually added to their ranks. So let me give you a couple examples. In Texas, Republicans overcame massive spending to defend their state House and Senate majorities. This was one of the top targets, the Texas State House in the country. In North Carolina, Republicans defied expectations by defending their Senate majority and growing their House majority by at least 4 seats as of the last update there. Interestingly, in North Carolina, I wanted to mention this. Mona had mentioned the reelection of Governor Roy Cooper, which, as Mona mentioned, was one of the top targets in the country, the top defense definitely on the Democrat side. So while Governor Roy Cooper was reelected as a Democrat, Mark Robinson will make history as the first African-American to be elected the state's lieutenant governor as a Republican. So once again, just as we had 4 years ago, that North Carolinians will have selected a Republican governor, or a Republican lieutenant governor and a Democrat governor. In Georgia, a huge battleground for the Georgia State House. The Georgia Republicans successfully defended their state House majority there. In New Hampshire, I mentioned that there was only 2 pickups across the country. So New Hampshire Republicans flipped the state House and Senate, making these the only legislative chamber pickups in the country. Florida Republicans added seats in both their state House and potentially an additional seat in their state Senate. And in Pennsylvania, this is one where Democrats had been really charging hard to flip chambers in the state Senate. Republicans flipped at least 1 seat, and there are still additional races too close to call. In the House, Republicans picked up 2 seats in Pennsylvania. Still some outstanding in the House as well. And so all of that said, where we are now is that after each sentence, once a decade, state legislative chambers are tasked with redrawing both the congressional lines, so the U.S. Congress line, as well as any state legislative maps. Now is the time. These are the majorities that will do that. And so in most states, like I said, the state legislature draws these congressional state legislative maps and then are approved by the governor. And so where you have Republican trifectas, of which there are now additional, so there are now GOP 23 state trifectas. What that means is where a state house, state senate, and the governor's mansion are all controlled by one party. Republicans will have 23 of those states, Democrats 15, and then there would be 12 states with divided government. So the point being, in 23 states, the Republicans will have sole authority to redraw and approve maps, Democrats 15, and in 12 states you'll have a divided government. And so that will have implications for the next decade of congressional power across the country.
And to put in perspective how this shaped up in 2020 versus 2010, in 2010, Republicans were able to flip 24 chambers across the country, and that was a voter backlash against the Democrats in Washington. The Democrats this year failed to pick up a single new chamber or governorship, and as Scott said, the Republicans won two new trifectas, one in Montana and one in New Hampshire. So looking at this race from a standpoint of how are businesses, how are trade associations, how are patient advocacy groups and interested citizens going to, what are they going to see looking forward from these new governments? There's a lot of stuff happening, and we can see that there's going to be interest in a number of issues, and we'll just tick through these issues. On our team, as Governor Hodges said, we've got more than 100 consultants based primarily in the southeast of the country and also in Washington, but we have worked in states across the country and are in touch with almost all of the governors and attorneys general and the key legislators in the various states. And so I'll just tick through a number of issues that we're facing. If you have issues that you'd like us to delve into more, we'd be happy to put you in touch with some of our subject matter experts, or if Scott or Mona or Governor Hodges can help answer some of these questions, we'd be glad to have conversations with you offline. But there's going to be a number of issues that are going to be at the forefront right now. Collective bargaining and right-to-work legislation, you're going to see those issues popping up. Taxes is an evergreen issue that will be fought on the State House. We're seeing school choice considerations taking place in Ohio, North Carolina, Wisconsin, some other places. And then there's a number of other issues, including energy. Lots of continued debate back and forth on things like pipelines, how folks will get their energy going forward, some of the lawsuits surrounding high-profile energy projects. In the healthcare space, this is an area of a lot of activity. Just recently, Missouri became the 38th state in the country to expand Medicaid. And so with a Biden administration, and then also either a Republican Senate or a Democratic Senate with a Democratic House, there's going to be lots of discussion about what's going to go forward with the AMA and how or with how the healthcare system is going to move forward. You're going to see issues related to Title IX, not just in terms of funding for college athletic programs, but also sexual misconduct allegations and how those are heard and what sort of guidelines are going to be in place for that. You'll see a number of issues surrounding the CFPB, consumer fraud, banking issues. That's going to continue to be a place where there's going to be a lot of activity. PPP loans and the Small Business Administration. You're going to see a lot of continued conversations about what needs to happen there, particularly if Congress acts, and then what happens with the states with their small businesses and how folks will continue to try to stay afloat during these uncertain times of the pandemic. You always see issues of price gouging. This is an area where attorneys general love to get involved. They try to enforce price gouging metrics during emergencies, natural disasters, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, but also with COVID, you've seen increasing activity from state attorneys general on this space. Also, in the fields of mergers and acquisitions, you see lots of antitrust suits taking place, and that's an area for a lot of government oversight. And then big tech. obviously concerns about what Facebook is doing and Google and the way some of those issues pop forward during the campaign. You're going to see increasing investigations and some eyeballs on those issues. And that leads into data privacy and cybersecurity, which is a concern for most companies out there, and there's a lot of activity there. And then finally, unemployment insurance. We've seen a number of states where they're struggling with the demands with higher than expected unemployment and sustained unemployment, and that's causing some concern for government activity. So you're going to see a lot of activity on all of those issues. And again, our team would be happy to speak with you or your colleagues on these issues if you have concerns and would like to delve deeper into these issues. We're also going to have an opportunity at the end of this conversation and would love to have you ask a question or two that you think would be good for the entire group. So please feel free to utilize the Q&A function. So now we'd like to transition a bit and ask Governor Hodges. You were a newly elected governor not too long ago, and you were just coming into power in South Carolina, and you obviously had a big shift in things in the way your life was being run. And you had election night with a big victory party, and that had to have been absolutely exhilarating. And then you wake up the next day, and you are the governor, the incoming governor of the great state of South Carolina. What sort of things did you have to do during your transition, and what are ways that private citizens and businesses and other interested parties can make sure that their voice is heard as new incoming governors and other elected officials are transitioning into power?
Well, despite what Mike thinks, I did not get a victory call from Franklin Roosevelt. I'm not quite that old. But I will say that when I was elected in 1999, as you said, during the course of the campaign, you really don't have much of a chance to think about transition. I mean, it's bad luck to think about that. And all of a sudden, the morning after the election, you're struck by several things. You've got life's transitions, moving your family, coupled with having to assemble a staff and prepare an inaugural address and get ready for a major transition, all in the period of, in my instance, about 60 days. And that's a pretty monumental task. At the same time, you have groups, interest groups and others who want to have your ear about everything from issues that may be addressed in an inaugural address or state of the state address to priorities for the administration, concerns about problems that are out there that perhaps were not addressed in the prior administration, staffing. I mean, there are a whole wide range of considerations that take place. So I guess an observation, when Mike mentioned this to me last week when we were talking about this, an observation is just to understand that during the course of the transition, there are many avenues to get to a governor and a governor's administration. It does not necessarily have to be the governor-elect or the governor. It's important for you if you have an issue of concern. It's important to understand who may say grace over that during the course of the transition. Knowing that, trying to connect with a transition director, often these transitions include a range of policy teams. You certainly have seen that at the federal level. It's really no different at the state. You often have a transition team and divide that team up into groups where they consider everything from personnel choices to taking a look at outstanding issues to assist the new governor. And I think understanding that, Mike, and connecting with the person or persons who might be responsible for that area, if it's tax policy, who is it that is running the transition on tax policy? Who's the staff director at the transition? What are you hearing about likely appointees to cabinet positions, and what relationship do you have? I often think, and since I've left office, that we advise clients to stay in close touch with the policy directors in campaigns, because frequently the person who is directing policy at the campaign is someone who ends up taking a seat in the administration and who is assisting in putting together everything from the State of the State address to some key issues that the new governor will address. So I think those are all important steps to take. Assessing who, particularly if you were on the wrong side of the election, who has good relationships with the governor-elect that you might know well and who might be sympathetic to your point of view on these things. Those are the sort of things that I think are very important. But most important, having a little patience, because at least at the state level, you are generally talking about no more than 60 days, and it's a 60-day sprint that involves a lot of changes in the life of a governor, but also in the life of a state government, and being a little patient in that regard and understanding it may take you a little more time to get your audience. And just a final word on this, and this was always my pet peeve, is when people would come in, your life as a governor or attorney general is generally run in 15 and 30-minute increments all day, and people that would come in to talk to you about an issue and that assume that you had an in-depth knowledge of all aspects of state government, that's a mistake, because governors have a lot of things to think about. And likewise, those that had a 20-slide PowerPoint to try to present to you in 15 or 20 minutes, that's a mistake too. So think about, when you have that moment or moments, think about the simplest way to present that information in a way that's compelling to either the governor or the governor's staff member, because of the time limitations that they face. Does that help, Mike?
Yes, sir. And I'd like to echo those sentiments. I served as a senior policy advisor in the Virginia governor's office, coming over from a campaign that was successful, and that is very, very accurate to sort of the experience that I had. But what we find is in a lot of administrations, you'll have young staff, some of whom are inexperienced, and while agency heads or key secretaries may remain from administration to administration, a lot of times those deputies and the ones who are really moving policy and making decisions on legislation, or at least in the initial input, those folks are young, they're inexperienced, they may not have subject matter familiarity. And so if you have the ability to schedule a meeting for 30 or 45 minutes and provide a tutorial on the broader subject, if they are unfamiliar with that area, that is very much appreciated and welcome. Tactically speaking, I think it's always better to have a one-pager or simple information as opposed to trying to put together a 20 or 30 or 50-page document or report that will just not be read. Make sure that you have your contact information on your documents with your cell phone and your email address. What we're seeing now, too, because of COVID, a major shift in the way government affairs is taking place. Just either last night or this morning, the state of Maryland just introduced new guidelines for how their legislature will be operating, everything from plastic shields around the desks of senators to limiting the number of visitors in the Capitol depending on how severe COVID cases are at that time, and also putting in new restrictions and regulations about who may testify and when before certain pieces of legislation. And so you're going to see a lot more happening based on text and email and Zoom calls or WebEx and the like, and less in person. So it's going to change the dynamic. And again, in these situations, it's best to be brief and to be focused. Lead with your ask and what you are looking to accomplish, and then go into the background and the detail on the backside. But if you spend all your time in a very short meeting or a short phone call trying to explain and give in-depth background, you'll either lose the elected official that you're speaking with, the senior staffer, or they're just going to be focused on replying to the myriad of emails that they have going forward. I think, too, articulating a value proposition of how you can help an incoming administration, a key elected official, or a legislator. figure out what sort of value you can provide to them, either as a subject matter expert, things that you've done in terms of jobs or net economic impact to a certain state. Tie yourself in whatever nexus you can have to the state and how you can be helpful. One of the other things is with a number of legislative initiatives taking place where people are borrowing ideas, the same idea that could be pursued in Indiana may be done in Minnesota, which could be done in North Carolina, which could be done in Arizona. Figuring out and doing your homework on the back end to see what has been successful and what has not been successful, and lessons learned from initiatives that began in other states. If you can provide that information, administrations really do appreciate having that perspective and understanding how this is going to impact your business in a way that they may not even be thinking about. A lot of times folks will want to accomplish their checklist of priorities, promises made, promises kept sort of arrangement. And in doing so, they want to get to their destination, and they're willing to compromise to make sure that they are good partners with businesses. And so providing that insight as to lessons learned, things that you saw that could work a little bit better, many times they do appreciate hearing those perspectives and are willing to compromise or at least hear you out. But you have to, in order to break through the noise, be brief, be focused, and articulate a value early on in that conversation or you'll be lost. And the other thing is just to keep in mind that you have to have your contact information on most or all of the documents that you have out there so that folks will be able to reach out to you. And we work with clients all the time in this space to figure out how, what legislation they need to be monitoring, what sort of regulations they need to be worrying about, what do they need to do in terms of lobbying compliance, what constitutes gifts, all of those sorts of detailed information that are absolutely essential, one, to making sure that you are on the right side of the law, and two, making sure that you have the ability to be successful in sharing your story and achieving your objectives. Scott or Mona, do you have any other observations from your work across the country and what new administrations are looking for and how folks can be most successful as they monitor in these new and difficult times?
I would just say from my experience of being a policy director on a gubernatorial campaign, I really appreciated people who came, before the campaign and then even after the campaign to share their thoughts and ideas, because the volume of what a governor, especially a new governor, will have to tackle is limitless. And so similar to good relationships on Capitol Hill between staff and folks downtown is when you are in a position where there's a value added in the information provided. I really always appreciated the people who took the time. And listen, I mean, it doesn't mean that, there's going to be activity on these efforts because there's clearly things that the governors ran on as candidates who want to implement as part of what they ran on as a platform that they now want to use as they move forward. But sharing ideas, bringing forth ideas, I think is always valued, whether it's immediately looked at or not. So I echo everything that you said. A real opportunity to build relationships. The other piece I'll say, and you highlighted it, is, I think always important. You can't assume that everybody knows your information. And so when you're always able to share, basic things like employees, why you're good corporate citizens in their communities, the value that you add, you can't assume that every staff person, every principal will know everything. You are most uniquely responsible for knowing what your best value is for your company. And so finding opportunities to showcase that and even find opportunities for partnership is always valuable.
Mike, this is Scott. One thing I was going to add was that if folks on the call, clients, are looking for ways to potentially support these newly elected governors going forward, perhaps maybe you called the race wrong and supported the other side, or maybe it wasn't a state that you're focused on, but would like to support in a way. As the governor mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, on transition. Every one of these newly elected or re-elected governors is planning a large party, and so those present opportunities to support, an inaugural, and supporting an inaugural provides a great way to go and see the newly elected governor, remind him that you support, and that you're there for their support going forward. I think that's a great way to continue to interface with campaigns or perhaps interface for the first time. Another thing I wanted to mention, Mike, is that it's important to remember that as you go to these newly elected governors and they're coming or they're receiving requests, whether it be things that they might have to spend money on, legislative or with executive authority, almost every governor that's been newly elected or reelected is coming into a new administration with some sort of budget deficit right now. And so where your priorities may require additional resources from the state, that's something to bear in mind as well, that without many exceptions, most states are seeing budget deficits due to revenue shortfalls because of the pandemic.
And Scott, just the final piece I'll say. I'm sorry, Mike.
Go ahead.
I was just to put a bow on what Scott was saying is that I think having worked for and around governors before, as best and really important, particularly now given some of the fiscal challenges that these states are facing, any opportunity for you to showcase your company as part of the public policy apparatus in ways that perhaps you can help a state or commonwealth save money, right? Like they are looking for ways to solve a multitude of public policy challenges now in the most sort of adverse economic situation that they've been in. So the ways that you might be able to showcase, obviously policy, but ways that when partnering with your companies, you can provide a value to the states in terms of being a quiver or an arrow in their quiver about in contending with the public policy crisis that they may be contending with, or ways you can actually help the state save money, I think would be valued incredibly by states across the country. Thanks, Mike.
And so we've received a couple of questions. We're gonna begin to go through a few questions that some of our attendees have. If you've got additional questions, please feel free to pose them in the Q&A section on your screen. We received one question here from MJ, and this is a question after my own heart. Looking ahead to the 2022 races, we only have 23 and a half months until the midterm elections, so we're looking forward to those. Now that the 2020 elections are behind us, how might companies begin to work towards positioning themselves for primaries in terms of building on record voter turnout, and also looking at the companies, how can companies look to do engagement in terms of supporting candidates whose platforms align with their business goals and the industry in which it operates? Scott or Mona, do you have any thoughts on this?
Mike, I could take the first piece and give you kind of a little bit of a preview, as you mentioned, on 2022. So everyone will probably remember 2022. This is the 4-year cycle that is the largest amount of governor's races of any of the 4-year cycles. And so 2022 will be host to 36 governor's races. 20 of those will be Republican defenses, 16 Democrat defenses. One of the things I was thinking about in preparation for the call is that many of these Democrat governors across the country, specifically you look at the Rust Belt, Michigan, Wisconsin, were elected in 2018 with the ability to run against President Trump. So if you think back and you follow the strategy of Republican governors and candidates going into 2014, you'd assume that these guys going into 2022 will see a similar strategy. They'll provide a counterpoint to the Biden administration. Candidates will run against the Biden administration, any mistakes they perceived or perceived overreaches. If you remember back to 2014, the similar cycle, that was the year that Republicans made historic pickups in Arkansas, Illinois, Massachusetts, and Maryland. So those are some thoughts on 2022. Mona, any thoughts from the Democratic perspective?
No, I mean, I think your point on sort of the global politics of this is that as I said at the beginning of the call, there were 11 races this year. There's 2, the big Virginia and New Jersey races, often a bellwether on a new administration, and then the 36 races. So the way that political folks who think about these races, they look at it very much in a 4-year cycle. And you've laid out nicely sort of the 36 races plus 3 if you 3 more if you include North Marianas, Guam, and Virgin Islands are also up in 2022. So I think that it's sort of no rest for the weary for a lot of these campaign national organizations that are continuing their fundraising, their political outreach, their recruiting, all is very much in a 4-year cycle. So they've already been planning, meeting with potential candidates and so forth. So I think, a little bit on how people can engage is we do a lot of work with a number of national organizations that work on behalf of elected officials. And so we're able to provide sort of strategic counsel and guidance and as we've been alluding to earlier, build those relationships on, early and often on the front end.
Governor, do you have some thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I do, Mike. Thanks. Great comments by Scott and Mona. Let me just mention some things that companies are doing. For our companies on the line, they might be interested in a few things that really go beyond just the 2022 elections themselves and more about trying to, strengthen themselves as organizations. There are 2 things that are going on right now that I think are really significant. We've had clients that we have engaged with who have asked us to help them evaluate their PAC programs. And, they are looking to both better educate their employees about what their PACs do, and also, frankly, trying to get broader participation, because we all know that the strongest political action committees and giving programs that companies have are those that have as broad a participation among those that are eligible to give as possible. So we have found that clients have asked us to assist them in doing an assessment of what they need to do to improve their employee understanding of their PAC programs and hopefully strengthen the participation in those. And I think it's a really smart thing that these companies are doing, because they understand that is one more way that they can communicate with their clients about the importance of good government or one more way that they can communicate with their employees about good government and hopefully have them engaged in matters that relate to the company. The second piece is that we have seen over the last year, particularly after the social justice issues came up, more and more companies that said, we want to be very nonpartisan in this, but we want to find a way to engage and talk with our employees about the importance of voting and about civic engagement and civic involvement and participation in the election process. So that's the other area where we have found that companies have come to engage us and talk with us about how they can, without offending their employees, how is it that we can be better corporate citizens and talk about the importance of voting and use social media tools and use our own internal tools to work with our employees in a way that we can encourage them to be good citizens. So those are a couple of things that I think are particularly important and cutting edge that companies are doing themselves. In both instances, I think the companies that have done this have been very happy about this, particularly since if you're a large company, there are a lot of questions raised about whether or not you are civically engaged and civically involved. And I think they view this as a bit of an insurance policy. And likewise, with the PAC program, these companies have been very pleased at the progress they've made in making sure that their employees understand what it is they're doing and why it's important to the company. So thanks for letting me pitch in on that. I think these are things that are going on now that companies that are doing that are making a big difference in their level of engagement.
One thing that I would add is the clients who I've helped that have been the most successful at these efforts have really taken a look at what their core values are as a company, and one of them is being a community player, a community partner. And we found that these employee engagement efforts and campaigns have reflected well upon the company and allowed them to express what they're for and how they want to be involved in a positive manner in their community. And they've seen significant dividends paid off from that. So it's an effort of being just a good corporate steward, which most folks want to be a part of. We have another question here from Tim about polling. And this the question here is, what are the initial views on polling trends? From the press, it really seemed that the state candidates were surprised on both sides. It wasn't just public polling, but it also appears that internals were way off, and this was a surprising result, particularly for the Congress, but I also assume on state legislative races too. How are people thinking about polling at this point? Is it a response rate error? Is it modeling? Is it turnout? Or do we need to wait for all of the votes and compare to the exit polls once reweighted to understand? And this is an excellent question. And there's going to be a lot of conversation about this. I fear that pollsters are now going to be looked at as meteorologists and weathermen who will be more encouraged to explain why they were wrong than actually be accurate in the future of presenting their information. Part of it, as you said, Tim, is the data and getting the information back from once all of the votes have been counted. In many places, that is yet to be the case. Also, there are some concerns, I know, as one example in Virginia, where ballots that were cast via absentee early voting, those ballots in a particular precinct would not be counted in the precinct results, but would rather go to a countywide absentee ballot precinct. So the votes that show up individually on individual precincts will not accurately reflect what happened in that precinct, because those people who voted early or voted absentee will be counted in a different central absentee ballot precinct for the county. So even the data, when it's fully collected, will not accurately reflect, at least in Virginia, what those Virginia voters did in a certain precinct and area. When you look, the polls have shifted. You see a number of things that, like Wisconsin, there were things that were greatly wrong. But overall, they did predict that Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, that Biden was going to win, albeit those numbers were off a bit. We are seeing a lot of folks, they call them the silent Trump voters, who either hang up on pollsters, do not respond to email or text messages, or will lie about those numbers. And so you're seeing a lot of information about what and who a silent Trump voter is and how they handle things. This does have implications for the state races. And while a lot of folks do have strong views about a particular governor or even a Senate race or a high-profile House race, a lot of times they have not fully formed their views on other things like an attorney general's race or a state legislator race. And that presents some problems for pollsters as they look. And you also have smaller sampling sizes. So polling is fraught with a lot of problems, and now the increased attention on being wrong, not just in the 2020 cycle, but also in the 2016 cycle, means that these numbers will be increasingly viewed with skepticism, and a lot of times will be outrightly ignored. Scott, Mona, or Governor, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I'm curious to hear from Scott and the governor in particular, but I think you're right to sort of make this bigger than 2020. This was clearly an issue in 2016. As someone who knocked on doors for the last week or so in a battleground state, I had my list of folks I was, in the days when you could knock on people's doors. I had these lists, and when you're talking to people in the last week or so, you're talking to like your voters, your super prime voters, where you're making sure they have a plan in which to vote for your candidate. And I was really amazed, again, in a battleground state, that the lack of response I was getting. People are usually very thrilled to tell you who they're voting for and that they have a plan. And so I was concerned that either the lists were wrong or that maybe people weren't willing to tell me, I was on the Democratic side, that they were voting for Donald Trump. And folks connected to the Trump campaign this year were saying that there was that sort of silent voter that Mike talked about, that in fact it might even be a greater number this year, because if you didn't tell folks the first time you were voting for Trump, there might be a thought that if you're doubling down to vote again, you're certainly not going to sort of relay that information. So I think, as we've been told from folks connected to, that we work with who are talking to the Trump campaign, they very much expected that was it. The other piece I'll say is I think what people learned in 2020 more than they did in 2016 is a lot of people focusing on the national polling and what the national numbers look like. And people were looking at the battleground polling, but there are a lot more of those state polls that were available this time. And I think people understood that, that they can't rest on what the national numbers, that they really have to look at the battlegrounds and have to look at, there were a lot of states that Hillary Clinton was ahead in the battleground in 2016, but not beyond the margin of error. And that was also another challenge, because either she could have won or lost within the margin. So I think, Mike, you're spot on your sort of thoughts on it, and Scott and Governor, I'll defer to you all.
Scott, you go first.
Sure. Well, I was going to echo the statements about this being an issue somewhat related to President Trump. And let's remember, I don't remember there being an issue this widespread of a problem with polling in 2012 or before that. If you remember back to 2018 in the midterms, I think the polling was much more accurate as well. And so I think that there is something to be said, whether it's that Trump supporters don't like to answer the phone for pollsters, especially from the mainstream media, or whether it's that there is this shy Trump vote out there that there was about 5% in 2016 is what they said. And, if you've been to a Thanksgiving dinner since then, you're less likely to talk about it, I think, and I think that there might be something to that. But I think there's something there as well. I think the other thing is that there may be an issue with traditional polling as you go forward. How many people do you know have a landline? How many people do you know have a landline that they answer? And so if these traditional methods of polling are not how people communicate anymore, you're going to have to do it in a different way. And I think that there'll be an increased emphasis or focus placed on data modeling, where more information just than your answers in a survey are taken into account. Things such as your consumer data and online preferences are factored into the equation, and these that I've seen in the past and have worked with in the past are far more accurate. So that's my opinion on the subject. Governor Hodges?
Well, I think all that you all have said is true. The old-fashioned statement would be you run until the race is over. So you work hard until the very end, and you don't depend upon polls to be any indication of anything until the votes are actually tabulated. And I think that's probably a pretty good philosophy to have. I think that's the philosophy that the Biden campaign tried to share with their supporters, because if you remember 2016, there were a lot of people that were measuring the drapes in different offices in Washington who were quite surprised on Election Day. I will say, Tim, I think that if you think that 2020 was bad, wait till 2022, because at least this time around we thought that there was a chance that there'd be a surge in Trump voters, because that's what happened in 2016. But you remember 2018, you had an increase, but nothing like now. What's going to happen in 2022? Those models are going to be even more unpredictable, because we don't know what impact Trump will have, if any, on that race. And even if he's still engaged, which I think he will be, are voters going to listen to him and be interested in showing up in 2022? If they're not, then we might end up having these models that think that the shy Trump voters are going to participate, and they aren't. Likewise, there may be this assumption that they will participate lightly in these elections, when in fact they participate in a heavy fashion. I say all that to suggest that we could have as much uncertainty in 2022 as we did around this election. I can't remember who made the comment, but at the end of the day, a lot of people thought that that Biden would get a little over 300 electoral college votes. That's about where he ended up. The margins were certainly different, but the outcome of this election in terms of the overall popular vote and who won and how many electoral college votes they had really was fairly accurate on most assessments. Mike, I'll kick it back to you, or to Mona.
We have another follow-up question regarding polling. And this question says, what are believed to be the most likely reasons why the so-called silent Trump voters are hanging up or lying to pollsters? Seems like rather strange behavior, and the supposition is that it's so widespread it almost feels conspiratorial. So excellent question here. And I guess from my own experiences, some of the things that I've seen in talking to a number of suburban women and talking to folks who do a lot of digital polling and digital advertising, they noticed movement, speaking with one consultant based in Nevada who was doing work in Arizona and Michigan and Wisconsin. He was saying that he saw a lot of movement in terms of ad rates and openings of email solicitation and the like for Trump voters with African-American men and Hispanic men, and that he was seeing the Latino vote, particularly men over about 35 or 40, shifting. Now, he said that we spoke probably the end of September, beginning of October, and he was saying that none of this data is being reflected in any of the polls that we're seeing internally or externally, in the public polls or the private polls. He said that just wasn't happening. We also saw a shift, a number of suburban women, and you saw some undercurrents of this, were feeling more attracted to the notions of public safety, law and order, as some of the protests and demonstrations were taking place, and some of the issues surrounding those issues in September. And so a lot of those women, the supposition goes, is that they were not actually they were not going to tell their friends or tell a pollster, a stranger, that they were considering voting for Trump. However, it was the law and order message was resonating. And then another conversation that I had, this went with Trump's election day staffers, one of the folks who was in charge of counting the votes in the Southeast. And his argument to me was that new voters do not necessarily equate to Democratic voters. The folks who have not voted in the past may not split 80-20 or 90-10 in favor of the Democrats, and that a lot of these folks would vote Republican and may, in fact, just vote, may be ticket splitters and vote for Republicans in key elections. I have that example with my brother-in-law. He's from central Pennsylvania. It's 35 minutes to get to a gas station, a liquor store, or a grocery store, which will make it uncomfortable to be there for the holidays and normal times. But he is one of these folks who has voted only twice in his life, and both times for Donald Trump. And I asked him if he was going to be either splitting the ticket and voting down ticket, and he said he absolutely would, but this is the first election that he would do so. I asked him if they had been contacted by any pollsters, and my sister-in-law actually had been, but they did not answer the questions because they just felt like the media was out to get them. They didn't want to engage, and they actually felt some satisfaction in going out and surprising the media, and in their minds, sticking it to the left-wing establishment media. So that's just a little bit of anecdote that we see from folks as to reasons why they would vote. And then one final point, and I'll turn it over to the group. You have seen Joe Biden, I believe, in the 2012 election, where he said, "Don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative." And so folks who may have supported one candidate or another in the primary may be actually taking a look at either voting for Biden or not voting at all. Some folks who were considering voting for Trump may have said, "Yes, I'll vote," or I'll withhold my vote. They won't necessarily vote for the candidate of the party opposite to what they believe. So it's not just voting for one or the other, but also undervoting and not participating in that election. And that also leads to chaos in the polling community. Any other final thoughts from the other panelists?
No, not for me. I think that covers it nicely.
Thanks, Mike. Well, I think we've come to the end of our presentation. Let me just say that we record these presentations. In the event there are pieces that you'd like to hear again, we'll send out a link to that so that you have it available. Likewise, if there are people that did not attend that you think would get a benefit from this, feel free to share the link with them as well. As always, any member of our team is happy to answer any questions you might have. If you'll email us, we'll try to answer questions you have about the elections around the country, the state elections, and likewise about any of the issues that were raised here today. Again, thank you for participating. We always have fun with these presentations, and hope you have a good day.
Thank you.